my right, we have Jason Neville. Sorry about that.
No problem.
From Building Blocks.
That's right.
To his right, we have Jerry Fink with Boscom.
Yep.
And to his right, we have Amalia with West Coast Common. So I thought we would kind of just jump right into the conversation with a bit of background on the recent work of the Milken Institute. We're working on accelerating workforce development housing paper that should be out in a few weeks that kind of takes a toolkit approach, looking at a number of different strategies and barriers that are preventing workforce or missing middle housing development, and what we can do to kind of overcome that 40% kind of uptick in development costs in California. So it costs about 40% more to build in some parts of California than it does compared to other states. So how do we deploy this toolkit to address some of those barriers? And I think what we have here is a really great assembly of different aspects to that. So Jason, why don't you talk to us a bit about Building Block, and in terms of scaling the ADU challenge, where do you see there's potential for growth and further, how are you mitigating some of the development costs associated with delivering an ADU product?
Sure. So I'm Jason. I'm CEO of Building Blocks. We're a design, permit, build ADU company based in Los Angeles. And I'm really excited to be here, especially since I've only built 2 units of housing in Los Angeles. So I'm hoping that when we finish our 3rd, I'll be invited back to Keynote next year. I cut my teeth on ADUs in Mayor Eric Garcetti's office on his innovation delivery team, which was funded by Bluebird Philanthropies to help cities innovate around priority areas that's determined by the mayor. And in our case, one of the priority areas from Mayor Eric Garcetti was housing. So we were looking at ADUs as a way to contribute to our city's housing supply. And when we started that research, I was issued a challenge by someone we were interviewing, and he said, if you can figure out a way, this is before we landed on ADUs as a strategy, he said, if you can figure out a way to build a unit of housing in Los Angeles for less than $300,000, then you're onto something. And I thought he was just being provocative because it seemed insane that might be possible. And yet it turned out that there was something that could deliver housing in Los Angeles for much less than $300,000, and that's ADUs. And I'd like to kindly take a little bit of friendly sparring with Heather earlier, who I loved that presentation. Some of the research we were doing in Los Angeles at UCLA as well rolled up into a state law that passed in January of 2017, creating statewide standards for ADUs. I could talk a little bit more about that law later, but suffice it to say, the state stepped in, set standards, and as a result, in Los Angeles, prior to that state law taking effect, we were building about 150 units, ADUs a year. This year, we'll build close to 5,000. So that's a 33x increase in ADUs. And people often ask me, what is the most innovative thing we can do to increase ADU supply? Is it modular construction? What is it? And I said, the biggest innovation is allowing it. And when allowed to do it, people are responding to it and making that happen. So I'm happy to get into a little bit more about some of the costs now or after we get some introductions from her.
Let's dive a little bit deeper there. On the call, we talked a bit about some of the design standards and permitting and some of the hard costs associated even with ADUs. But it was brought up a little bit earlier, but what the parking requirements, talk a little bit more about some of that.
Sure. Basically, parking is not required for ADUs in Los Angeles, because state law says that if you're within, I want to say, a half a mile of any transit, then the parking requirement is waived, which is effectively all of the city of Los Angeles. So to tick it off, a couple of key things that reduce development costs for ADUs is, first of all, that there's no land cost, because you're building on land that is already acquired by the homeowner. It's a by right process, thanks to state law. There is no local ADU ordinance. I can be fact checked by Kevin. That's not the case, but City of Los Angeles is deferring to state law, and as you just mentioned, there's no parking requirements.
I think that's interesting. Jerry, Boscom has been doing a lot of this, and you have a big portfolio of multifamily that is you know, been turning over property for a number of years. But kind of going back to the opening framing around the costs, how is Boscom able to that, or how are you addressing that per unit on costs on a delivery? Or have you seen some of that, the state uptick in terms of overall costs, or how are you able to mitigate some of that?
Yeah, well, the cost issues are the biggest problem we've got today. And how we're mitigating it is we're not buying fully entitled apartment land. We're having to go buy industrial commercial land, spend 3 to 5 years going through the process to get a lower use entitled to, high density apartments. So that process takes 3, 4, 5 years. And so instead of paying full retail for the land, you buy it at 50% or a 60% discount. So you got to start with the land first. And then when you go into the site or the building design, almost every time you start designing the building, you realize my return on cost doesn't work. It's a 5 or 5.5. And if I'm building to that low return on cost, I'm not going to get the deal financed or built. And so we have to go back to the drawing board and try to find out how do we, manage these costs to get the cost of the building down to a certain level so we can get those return on costs for, we're doing 2 type 1 high rises in downtown LA, and it took a lot of work to get those to a 5 3/4 return on cost. And our suburban multifamily is more of a high 6 return on cost, but it takes a lot of work, and there's a lot of science to it too. Is you look at the unit and go, do I need a kitchen island? So can I get rid of a kitchen island? Can I get rid of hallways and have the bedroom doors open up to essentially a living room? And so and also looking at just building smaller units. So maybe in the old days you didn't care about hallways or kitchen islands, you'd build these 900,000 square foot units. A lot of our projects today, they're averaging 650 to 750 square feet per unit. So the units are getting smaller and more compact, and we're getting rid of things like kitchen islands, hallways, and then going with, 9-foot or 10-foot ceilings. So they've got the volume, but the floor area is shrunk down as well. And so those are some of the things we're doing on the interior of the unit. On the stacking, we're trying to keep the floor plans to maybe only 3 floor plans. And so we do all 1 bedrooms in kind of one quote unquote tower, or all 2 bedrooms in the same tower, so you can take the same, wet system or piping system versus going all around the building. So we're looking at the plumbing, the configuration of the units, limiting the number of options of units, and then building bigger buildings so that same elevator services a lot more units versus a hodgepodge of units on a site. So it's becoming a real science of trying to maximize the efficiency of a unit. I think several years, 8, 9 years ago, if it was 65, 70% efficiency, thought that was great, no one cared. Today you've got to be 85, 80, 90% efficient to get the cost to work out. So.
We all saw the Triple H audit that Mayor Garcetti responded to around somewhere north of $600,000 that we're paying for the Triple H housing per unit. Amalia, I think that is kind of indicative of what you're doing in terms of the co-living space. I think that's kind of a good segue into from Jerry in terms of what's the the co-living solution here in terms of millennials or even furthering equity in terms of housing supply.
Sure. So I'll just give a quick outline of Cohen itself. Cohen is the nation's leading residential brand and operator that first started out with co-living units, and we actually have expanded to micro units and traditional units as well, where we can bring affordability, convenience, and community to the tenants while also increasing the value of our real estate partners' property. And what I like to kind of go back to is the data point that I got from CoStar last year, which is in Los Angeles alone, 75% of people make less than $75,000 a year. If you look at what is being constructed in the market, 87% of new construction is affordable to those making greater than $75,000 a year. So you have this huge discrepancy in terms of what is out there in the market for people that are making the median income. And it's something that has been happening already where people just live with roommates. So co-living is purpose-built roommate housing, where a lot of people are already living with roommates in 2 to 3 bedroom units, but we're saying we can make it even more affordable for people, and you can create 3, 4, 5, 6 bedroom units and really provide a discount to the renter, but more importantly, it is a 20 to 40% increase in NOI for the developer, which makes it feasible for them to build in this high construction cost environment. So that's something that we're seeing that's really exciting. Here in LA, most of the developers we work with are building to a 6.5 to 7% yield on cost. And it's kind of, you can actually go and make a lot of these buy right projects work with larger units.
And I think the other thing too, it's interesting is much as co-living is like this new term, it's been going on in LA for a long time. And we do a value add deal and do an inspection of an apartment. I'd say 2/3 or 50% of the units, there's 2 sets of bunk beds in the bedroom, there's 2 or 3 beds in the living room, and it's not uncommon to have a family living in a bedroom where it's husband, wife, and 2 small children. And so you may have 10 or 12 people living in a 2 or 3 bedroom unit. So, they're taking that $2,000 rent, and you go, how can someone afford that? And dividing up among 4 or 5 wage earners and paying $300-400 a month. So it's kind of going on whether you like it or not. It creates all kinds of problems with crowding and other issues. So.
Yeah, it's interesting. It's interesting how this conversation kind of immediately gets into some of the larger cost of living challenges and even around the future of work and the labor markets that we're supporting. But, and it was asked in the last panel, and I think we'll ask it again here, from your perspectives, what do you see as a best practice in terms of working with the city or how can they better support development that is more intentional around lowering costs?
Well, I think the challenge is, they talk at me in game, they want more housing, but then they go, here's a fee, there's a fee, you need 25% affordable, and so they pile on all the stuff, and then, by the way, there's 100,000 of fees, a portion low income, and by the way, you have to use unions to build it. And so the combination of all these things produce a cost that's 20, 30% too high, and 9 times out of 10, the math doesn't work to build the building. So even though there's good intentions, all the forces out there are working to kind of suffocate this feasible deal that should have worked in a normal private world. So.
Yeah, I would agree with that, and I think that's part of the reason why it's taken off in LA. We have 1,700 beds under development just in LA, is that you can build less units, so you have less fees, and your parking requirements aren't as high on like a bed to unit or bed to person ratio, whatever you want to call it, because usually you max out at about 2 parking spots per unit in LA. So we've seen that this works for us. 40% of our members are new to cities, and so we're seeing that same percentage of people who don't have cars in LA. So really educating the city on, parking. If we can reduce the parking requirements, as you know, it makes developments much more feasible, and really working on that.
And the parking is a tough issue because, you'd love to say in 10 years no one's going to drive a car, but today, if you're leasing a Class A building, the renters who can pay those rents have very nice cars and want a place they can park the car. They don't want to walk down the street in a parking lot. So we're at this difficult kind of junction right now where you can't really build a building with no parking because it won't lease up at those rent levels. So, but maybe in 10 years you won't need the parking. So we're in this strange zone of how do you navigate through that.
But in that sense, I would say you can build a building with no parking. For a certain, obviously in certain transit-oriented areas. In Seattle, we have micro units that we manage, and they're actually between 200 to 220 square feet. And people live there and are happy to live there, and there's no parking, and those have been really successful. I think we're getting $5.40 per square foot on a monthly basis. So there's ways that you can kind of work around it. You have to have the right kind of tenant.
What is that tenant?
I think it's a So for us, we target people that are making the median income who may not have the nicest cars or need the nicest cars. And so since they're more mobile, they really kind of pack things up with a suitcase and don't necessarily have a lot of things. And they're willing to say, hey, I don't need a parking spot, I'll sell my car. A lot of times here in LA, some employers are charging extra for parking. We decouple parking as well. We charge extra and incentivize them not to use their parking.
Does that mean you're looking at establishing more co-living development or just looking at areas in and around transit? Or is this like downtown and infill? I mean, that could also be next to transit, but is that kind of land use alignment something that you guys are factoring in?
The goal is to look for places near transit. Obviously, if they're not near transit, we still have projects open, but they do have a portion of parking because you can't build no parking kind of in a more suburban area.
Or I think if you get a area around USC or UCLA where you get a big student population where they're flying in from Asia or East Coast and then they don't have a car, it works great.
Jason, we talked a bit about the streamlining side, so like the regulatory mitigation and some of the streamlining aspects. But like for the homeowners here who are becoming developers, like through that permitting process, what does that timeline usually look like for an ADU?
Well, it depends. The easiest way to go about it, as far as I can tell, is doing a garage conversion, which is why about 50% of ADU permits are for, actually I think it's more than that, I think about 70% of ADU permits are for garage conversions. Although about half of those, as best I can tell through some conversations with building and safety folks, are legalizations of existing units. So those ADU numbers I gave earlier, which by the way is 12,000 since the state law took effect in Los Angeles alone, which is 15% of the new housing supply in our city. About 50% of those garage conversions, as best the city thinks, are legalizations of pre-existing unpermitted units. But because there's thresholds for fees that start in Los Angeles about 500 square feet. So for school fees, LID impacts, which was a pain for us, you can come under that. So if you can build a less than 500 square feet, which a typical garage is 400 square feet, you're sort of bypassing a lot of regulatory and fee and city fees. And just to connect to the fee question that you're talking about with the affordability, in a project we recently completed, the homeowner who was sort of community-minded was looking to rent that newly created ADU to a neighborhood resident who was making, less than the median income. Got hit month after month with fees from the city, including fees to draw our certificate of occupancy, which we weren't even anticipating, which is the Quimby fee, because if I can make a suggestion to my friend at the city planning department, Quimby fees don't exempt ADUs except those in R1 neighborhoods, but many ADUs are being built in R2, R3, even C2. So we got hit with a $7,000 bill just to pull our C of O, and after all that culmination of fees that we were not planning, the owner had to look to rent it out to a demographic that he wasn't initially thinking about in order to recoup all those costs on his investment. So the fees and those sorts of things do, I think, make an impact on affordability. I don't think it's the only thing, but I've seen that once or twice in some of our work.
Yeah, I like the garage conversions. The other one that we've seen, or I've seen personally that's been kind of interesting, is taking a big one-bedroom unit, which in the old days you had a big living room, you watched a football game in there, but today's youth, goes in their bedroom with a laptop and watches Netflix. And so they don't gather in this living room like they did before. And so it's taking this big living room area, carving it up into another bedroom, and now you've got this, one bedroom being converted to a two bedroom. It looks a little funky, but it's actually fairly easy to do in LA because you need a window and you need a door, and most areas have that already. So.
That's actually exactly one of our new strategies is how do we create more housing stock that's existing today already, and that is there are so many units that have been built that are larger and that don't necessarily need this huge kitchen living area and just adding a bedroom there. So we have a project opening in a couple of months in Larchmont Village that was originally built as 100% 3 bedrooms, where we went in late stage construction and said let's add in another bedroom and increase that density.
Yeah, I wanted to just say that, although I'm a sort of an ADU guy these days, I'm not really that interested in ADUs. I'm interested in small scale housing innovations that drive down the cost and fulfill what Heather was talking about, the missing middle. And some of the lessons I anticipated so far fairly correctly, that getting into the ADU space would lead to insights in something a little more dense than ADUs. And I'm happy to say that I'm working with a nonprofit developer now, Restore Neighborhoods LA, to build the first bungalow court project in Los Angeles in 70 years, and which is basically 8 ADUs on an R3 parcel that was made possible through the TOC ordinance that Kevin and others were talking about, which waived parking fees for affordable housing. So it's going to be 100% affordable for formerly homeless residents. And we're also, just to throw it out there, we actually crowdfunded about 10% of the total development costs in order to give neighbors skin in the game on new housing in their neighborhood, and to provide neighbors in lower income neighborhoods an opportunity to benefit from real estate investments that are happening in their neighborhood. So I think my forecast personally for multifamily, or where at least our company, is to kind of take those lessons learned from small scale housing development and just dial them, instead of dialing back a 50 to 100 unit into the 10 to 20 unit range, we're dialing up ADUs into the 5 to 20 unit range to see what kind of impact we can make.
A tenant in every backyard.
Well, and I should say also, speaking of legislative updates, that the state passed a new ADU law in the recent legislation session, and I'll just tick off what it does. First, it bans, so it takes ADU law a step further. It bans bans owner occupancy requirements. Second, it sets a standard setback distance of 4 feet. It used to be 15 feet in LA, now it was down to 5, now apparently it's 4. It eliminates impact fees, to our conversation, for units less than 750 square feet. And perhaps most importantly, you can add a second ADU for a total of 3 units on any single family zoned property in the state of California, which I don't think I completed my thought earlier, which is just doing some friendly sparring with Minnesota to say that we actually eliminated single family zoning in California statewide in January of 2017 for duplexes, and now for triplexes as of a few weeks ago.
And
Is that already in effect? Sorry, you really got me with that. But is that already in effect?
It will take effect January 1st of 2020, I believe, yep.
I think that's the biggest issue affecting the affordability or lack of housing is, people are focusing on these giant towers or large buildings, but this development boom, you've seen very little 8 to 10 unit or 12 unit development because it's too infeasible to take a triplex on a big lot, tear it down, build a 10 unit, because when you layer on all these fees and regulations, the math never works. And about 8 months ago, we found a developer that had some parcels in Hollywood, great location. He was buying it for $20,000 a unit. We thought, oh, this has got to work to build a little 30-unit project. And we went out to 25 different general contractors, and the lowest hard cost bid we got was like $400 per foot, which you couldn't build it. And that developer had spent several years trying to find the magical solution to building this building, even though he was getting the land at a massive discount. And so what's happening is you're not seeing in LA or Orange County or Southern California really any small buildings being built because you can't make the math work. And all you're seeing is the big 200-300 unit, more institutional buildings. And so there's a huge portion of supply that's not being done. That if you look back at the 80s or 70s, there was always a wave of those smaller buildings being built. But today, you can't make the math work because of the cost, the fees, the regulations, et cetera.
Yeah, I mean, we are seeing some of the math working, but it's 10 units at 5 bedrooms each. And, we're renting them out at anywhere from $1,500 to $1,800 per bedroom, but that's all inclusive. So we get rid of all of the inconveniences that come with roommate living. So it's fully furnished, utilities, Wi-Fi included, weekly cleaning. And so you can really live there at a discount to a studio, and it kind of works. But, it's getting harder and harder, too, to make those deals work.
Yeah. Staying with that, the number of units and some of the caps that we have on that, do you when you guys look at a potential development, do things like CEQA, do those factor into the equation here in terms of cost and some of the uncertainties around approvals? I know we've talked to a number of developers that say they try to stay under that. The unit cap in order so they don't have to deal with some of that. process, but how does that factor into this conversation?
We're seeing that same exact thing. So most of our ground up development is sub 50 units, mostly by right, but you can build 70, 80,000 square feet sometimes with that 49 units if you're building 4 or 5 bedrooms. And so we're starting to see that nowadays. So you can kind of build at scale without necessarily having to build more than 50.
Jerry, from an infill standpoint, I guess since you guys are acquiring properties, that doesn't really factor in from a deal standpoint, but I guess some of the costs associated with like infill potential, you have some run-in with CEQA there.
Yeah, I think we're almost doing the opposite, what she's doing, where she's building the big 5-bedroom units. We're doing, we're pushing ourselves more toward 1-bedrooms and studios because you can get a much higher per square foot rental rate to make the math work. Because as you go to the big 3 and 4-bedroom units, you get a bigger gross rent, but your per square foot rents start diminishing. And those are just the challenges. I look at all of our new projects, and most of them are 650 to 750 average square feet units, which is a big reduction from something I would have built 10 years ago.
Jason, I'm fascinated with the kind of the approach and the what's coming together around supportive for ADUs. But do you see that scaling to can we use the ADU approach if we wanted to take a more broader look at different development standards like missing middle? Can we do more duplexes and triplexes and fourplexes from using kind of like an ADU approach? Is that?
Yeah, I mean, that's exactly what we're doing with the Bungalow Court project. That one, like I mentioned, is affordable, so we're getting some of the county operating subsidies for the rents, which, to your point, we're doing small 1-bedrooms, so it's helping balance out the construction costs and make it cash flow. But we're getting no capital subsidies, and this is literally a prototype because it hasn't been done in 70 years. And what I'm hoping to learn, we expect to break ground next month, is that this is a typology that can be built in the private marketplace without subsidy. That's where I would love to get as a small-scale infill developer, is building new, naturally occurring affordable housing without public subsidy that is really well designed. One of the things that I'm most proud of for the Bungalow Court project is that it's going to be beautiful, and we think that part of making the case for affordable housing in Los Angeles is building something that neighbors will welcome into their neighborhood. So design is a big part of that for us as well.
Yeah, I know that Governor Newsom has set a really bold number that we know we want to achieve. And looking at the executive order last year that he directed DGS to identify some of potential sites for development, and I think what we'll expect is some kind of RFP process that'll come from that. What would we recommend in terms of leveraging those sites and those opportunities from a housing development standpoint? How would this conversation inform potentially what the state could do with those pieces of land?
Well, I'd like to answer that a little bit differently if I could, which is to take some lessons from Minneapolis. So starting next year, you'll be able to build 3 units on a single-family zone property, but only if you have one there already, and only if you build them sequentially. Only then do you get the benefits of the increased unit count and of the parking waivers and the fee waivers. But what you couldn't do is take that exact same parcel and build 3 new units in a triplex configuration from the get-go, like I'm hearing you could do in Minneapolis. We always show the best stuff from our cities when we go around to other cities, but the image from Minneapolis of that triplex was really beautiful. That can't be done under our current ADU rules. So speaking of what the governor could do is, if you can, one of the problems I foresee is actually you're going to start to see 3 little houses on a single family properties. That isn't really the most efficient way to build 3 units on a property, nor is it the nicest looking way to do it. Why not just do what, if you were saying we can build 3 units in an R1 zone, why not just let 3 units be built on an R1 zone with a parking reduction and get a better quality product at the end of the day that is more economically feasible and can get to the scale that you were asking about?
Yeah, I would agree. I think that big challenge to LA is you've got just a lot of parcels where you've got a little 1,000-square-foot bungalow sitting on a big lot. And if you can find ways to say, hey, you can now build 3 units on that lot, and we're going to waive a lot of these impact fees and other things so we don't burden you with all the cost, and make that a fairly simple process so the homeowner can scrape the old house, build 3 units, and people have 3 little homes there. The bigger buildings, I think it's a function of allowing more density. I think it's another function of not handicapping the projects with a portion of low-income housing, because it sounds great, but then you end up not having buildings being built and you have less supply being built. Those are things I think would help. And I think the biggest solution is just there's so many little parcels that you could build that duplex, triplex, fourplex on. And right now there's almost no construction of that because it's just not feasible today because the costs are so significant that the individual owners can't afford to go build those buildings.
So I actually think we should be looking at different ways of delivering capital A affordable housing. Common was just awarded as the winner of Share NYC, where New York City said, we see that co-living as a solution to affordable housing. Let's see how we can implement this in our city and really provide tax credits that this can be a capital A affordable project. And I would love to see that happening kind of throughout California. So we're partnering with L&M Development, which is one of the largest affordable housing developers in New York City, to create different income bands, 60%, 80% of median income, so people can live in a co-living project and it can work for everybody.
I think the other issue too is you look at government regulations and fees and so forth, and that probably adds 30-35% to your cost of your building. And so when you look at these development deals, you're usually about 10% off, meaning I need a 5.75 or 5 3/4 return on cost to get capital attracted, but I'm coming in at a 5 1/4. And so if you could find a way to chop off or reduce or waive some of these government fees on there, another wave of buildings would be built that wouldn't have been built normally. So,
I think that's a really interesting point. Have you and at Boscom have you been able to kind of compartmentalize that and advise your government or local community leaders on how they can do that, or is there is there a toolbox that you guys bring to the table that say, if you can help us do this, we can deliver this at the end of the day?
No, it's pretty much not negotiable. So all these fees are standard. I mean, there's certain things like the amount of affordable, you can negotiate that, but most of these fees, it's a set fee and you can't really change it, unfortunately. So, right. But I think they have to go back and say, kind of like the Opportunity Zone program where it's creating all this development in certain areas, is go back and say, hey, we want more apartments being built, so all these fees we lather on, we're going to reduce them or lower them or something to help that impact. Or maybe it's these fees will pop up 10 years later or something, but not hit today. So.
I know we're creaking into lunch here, so if people want to get their questions ready, I think we'll give some final thoughts and recommendations. But I mean, in parting, I know, Jason, you kind of already talked about the scalability potential of an ADU program into different supportive typologies. So, and a preview of what's to come in terms of City Hall's support. But from this ADU perspective, I mean, what do you think the realm for supportive state policy needs to be to continue a viable program and to really shine a light on the benefits around an ADU model?
Sure. I think one thing that's really interesting about ADUs as a housing typology, and like I said, they're now 15% of the supply in Los Angeles, is that the developers are the homeowners. So the homeowners so on the one hand, the homeowners don't really know how to do that, which is why I'm hoping they'll hire me. But it's also, Greg was talking about the mortgage interest tax deduction as a homeowner benefit. ADUs are as a homeowner benefit law that's responding. The homeowners are the beneficiaries of it. Now, hopefully, tenants will also be the beneficiaries, although you're not required to rent them out. You can have family members living it, and you could illegally rent them to Airbnb. So it's designed to help homeowners. And I think that's sort of the bargain with a constituency that's been so historically opposed to building any new housing that we had to invite them into the game of being developers in order to get them on board. And you are now seeing, in my opinion, some of the hypocrisy of some of our single-family homeowners who have been so vociferous about opposing housing in their neighborhoods, but now that given the opportunity to do it themselves, they are jumping on it because it makes all the sense in the world. If I can build you an ADU on your property for $300 a square foot or less, and at the end of the day, it's your per square foot values are $700, $800. You've just tripled the value instantly. So I think it makes sense to look at housing production through more of an equity lens, and also through at the end of the day, what does the product look like? Is it a main house with 2 smaller things in the back? Or is it a nice looking triplex or fourplex? The lesson learned for me from ADUs is, and the results exceeded far anything that I had thought in terms of production, is that if you make it legal and easy and legal and by right, you'll get the production virtually everywhere. I mean, it won't all be West LA, but ADUs are being built throughout the city. The main epicenter is actually the San Fernando Valley, where lot sizes are bigger, but they're being built in South Los Angeles, basically being built everywhere except for hillsides because it's just hard to build stuff in hillsides. So make it legal and people will do it, but do it with a lens towards what's the final product in terms of its affordability and its design to make our neighborhoods and our city better.
One last thing there. How are people leveraging, I mean, from a financial standpoint? Are they using, or are they running into barriers in terms of loan products that let them do ADUs? Is there a whole ecosystem out there emerging to help homeowners do?
There's a new industry that's been created in California for accessory dwelling units. Designers, high-end architects, draftsmen. So by the way, if you're doing a type 5 single-story construction in Los Angeles, you don't actually need a licensed architect. You can have a draftsman. So there's draftsmen hanging out at development services on FIG with their business cards, willing to draw you up an ADU for $1,500. And prefab is happening. There's a financial services industry that's starting to respond to it, but to answer the question directly, most of what I'm seeing is people taking cash out refis to pay for it, and home equity lines of credit and all that, not construction loans. We're not meeting with the bank, at 20% completion to get draws that would slow the whole thing down.
And the reality is it's already going on today, so the goal is to legalize it, because right now you'll see an RV parked in the backyard and someone's living in there. I was in San Jose about a year ago and someone said, let's do a search on Craigslist for what can you rent for under $1,000 a month. And the only thing that popped up was a tent in someone's backyard. and then you had like shower rights or bathroom rights a couple times a day, and that was what you got. And it was fully leased. And so much like we talked about, like people are already putting people in bedrooms or living rooms and garages. So it's kind of happening. I think, and if you look at Southern California, it's a sea of single family with a few pockets of density. And if you can find ways to make that single family low density, which a lot of times is built in the 50s or 60s or 70s, tear some of those down, build some duplexes, triplex, fourplexes, it'd go a long way toward solving a lot of the problems. And again, today the biggest issue is affordability and the legal process. And a lot of these homeowners don't have the skill set to go do this, so you have to create a little vendor system that can do it turnkey for them.
You guys have done, you have a big portfolio and done a lot of projects, but that lends me to think that there's stuff that we're not doing in the multifamily space from your approach. Like what's the size of like the scalability of this model from your from Boscom approach, and how can the state or the city or the county help
I think the biggest issue is making the process smooth and efficient, because right now if you go do it, you probably couldn't do it. Whether it's the neighbors that oppose it or the city officials or the cost be too prohibitive. So right now it's a cost issue, it's a legal issue. There's too many things that would prevent it. But if there's ways you can make the process smooth and efficient, make the approvals fast, and then create this little ecosystem of vendors that can do it turnkey, I think that's the solution. So.
And Amalia, what's the future of co-living? Is Is there, should we be looking at putting co-living developments in and around community colleges? Is it an available land issue? Is it, where should we scale this?
What we're seeing now is incorporating co-living into existing developments that are just a portion of the building. And it's going to just become like a unit type. Instead of a studio, you can live in a co-living bedroom. And in some of these units, some of these projects that are 100+ units, we're saying, why don't you reduce your lease-up risk by offering a portion of your units to be co-living, offering a lower price point for people to get in, and then when they're ready to have more privacy, they get a promotion or they get married, they can transfer into one of your other units and kind of stay within the building. So we see that as a win-win situation.
We had an intern, and I saw him and he was working on his little personal deal, and I go, what's that? And he said, I got this little co-living house. I've kind of, it was near USC or somewhere, and he had bought a house and was renting out by the bedroom. And then he had a little kind of house mother that would oversee the little, 4 or 5 bedroom place. It was fully furnished, had cable TV, so if you were a student or had moved to LA for a job, you could pay this, higher than normal rent, but you could kind of move into a 4 or 5 bedroom house and have this little roommate situation, family situation, fully furnished. And he was doing great. The only negative was it was not allowed in his little subdivision. So he had to kind of befriend the neighbors to make sure they would let him not, or call the police or whatever. So the problem is, even if you want to do that, you can't do it. So they've got to find ways to say, hey, we're going to encourage that, make it legal to do that to get more of that happening. So,
Have you explored the idea of subdividing tents in people's backyards?
We should.
I'm sure it's happening.
That reminds me, you hear those the anecdotes like Airbnb and like San Francisco, like rent this tent in this backyard, only $1,200 a month. So, any final thoughts or insights that we left? I don't think so. Any questions from the audience?
So thank you. This is very insightful. So this is for Commons. Do you guys do master leases, or are you guys strictly operators? Why and why not? Also, with the developers that you guys partner with, how are they getting over the hurdle of the takeout financing with the uncertainty of the product and the cap rates and stuff like that?
Sure. So in the early days, the only way we could really make it work, we started in 2015, was through master leases. Now, almost 90% of our pipeline is management agreements, and I think you kind of know why in seeing what kind of companies with master leases trying to IPO are having issues with. And we want to really create a solution that is profitable on kind of a unit economics basis, but also we've gotten feedback from lenders that said, look, if you're master leasing our building and you go away, the tenants that are with you are not, they don't have a lease with the building entity. And so what we're able to do is say everybody is on the same lease per unit, the lease is with the building, so if for some reason something happens to Common, nothing needs to change. So because we're starting to get more lenders more comfortable, we actually had our first takeout financing by Fannie in our home in Common MacArthur in Oakland. We had a Freddie takeout on a micro project, so that one wasn't co-living. But I personally toured Fannie and Freddie myself, Common Marcy in New York, and they said, hey, if even our analysts can't afford to live in the cities that we're operating in, then we have a problem. So they're open to new ways of living, and they just want to get comfortable, and so far the way we're operating is getting them comfortable.
Quick question, this kind of goes more to what was mentioned before about the homeowner tax credits. Does anyone kind of have an opinion on whether or not extending a homeowner tax credit to renters, say for example to make up the difference between someone spending 50% of their income where they really should be spending more 30%, would that help to, as a policy tool to help solve this problem?
As a renter, I strongly support that.
But I think in some ways you've got that with Section 8. So Section 8 says, based on your income, you can only afford $600, but we'll give you a $400 voucher. So they've kind of got that program in LA currently.
So in Los Angeles, with the advent of permanent supportive housing ordinance, right, there has been the ability to increase density with multifamily housing. Are you guys seeing this as a methodology that can be used with smaller lots, larger densities, greater densities, and even master leases with social services or agencies that'll provide a subsidy as being something that's viable that will attract capital?
Yeah, I think we're seeing that in a number of different permanent supportive housing developers like Flyaway Homes that's using the prefab model and co-locating services. And I think they have a few developments underway, and there was a write-up on them in the LA Times a few months ago, earlier this year. So I think there is some support for that, but
I can actually answer that because I'm working with some developers who are entering that exact space that you just described, which is they're building or assembling a $120 million fund to do PSH, focused in Southern California, but perhaps expanding to Silicon Valley. So the combination the combination is taking advantage of PSH and TOC ordinances to get 20 to 50 unit projects by right, and coupling it with the operating subsidies that are out there right now to avoid having to go through the traditional LIHTC process and to avoid the regulatory barriers from traditional capital A affordable housing. So in terms of where this whole market is headed, I through at least one of the partnerships I've been developing, am seeing some massive capital moving towards it that is not, it's capital that's just looking for somewhere to go, and this happens to be something that's providing the return. That's not people that come from my world, which is sort of equity-driven, small-scale housing innovators. These are people parking big sums of money on something that they've taken a big bet on. So I'm definitely seeing the characteristics of the market you just described.
Yeah, I'm seeing a lot more capital that wants to do that. The challenge is whenever they kind of go dig into an individual deal, it doesn't pencil. So they're stuck at, hey, I'd love to go do this program where I go build 20 to 30, 40 unit buildings throughout LA. And they run the same problem, which is when you tack on the fees and you don't have the economies of scale, all of a sudden the math doesn't work now and you can't build it. So they have to go back to how do we make those deals more feasible by more density, reducing fees on them, doing things that will encourage development. And I think if they can do that, there would be a significant amount of construction in those smaller buildings. But right now, you think it's a cool idea until you run the numbers and go, it doesn't pencil out. So
let's thank Matt and his panel for finishing up what I hope you found to be a stimulating morning. Thank you all. So that's the end of our program for this morning. Thank you very much. And thank you all our panelists, speakers, writers, organizers, etc. Have a great afternoon.